Welcome everybody to our 14th Terrestrial University. I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion, not only because we have lovely guests, but also because we are once again diving deep into the critical zone, into its many wonders and beings, looking for stories that might help us reorient and reposition ourselves in what Bruno Latour calls the new climatic regime. Tonight is going to be all about our more than human cohabitants, plants. Especially since Western modernity, we seem to have forgotten how to pay attention to plants. We have learned to categorize them, classify them, use them as resources, but we have become unaware of the connections we share, of the codependencies that involve us with plants, and the many stories they tell if only we listened. As Donna Haraway says, it matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. And since we all know that the climate crisis is also a crisis of imagination, it is about time we learn to pay attention to our plant relatives again. In this spirit, the exhibition Critical Zones has gathered some artworks sharing plant stories, such as Raíz Aérea by Edith Morales, Sine si po, sine liana by Barbara Marcel, Wild Relatives by Yumana Mana, or even Cloud Studies by Forensic Architecture. Another work tracing the history of plants throughout different territories is Soil Affinities by Uriel Orlow. And I am delighted to welcome him to the discussion, along with Lili Carr and Peter Nick. So Uriel, Lili, Peter, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It really is an honor to have you as companion speakers. And yeah, I'll quickly introduce you to our audience. Uriel, you are an artist joining us from Lisbon tonight, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And as I just mentioned, you are part of our exhibition with your piece Soil Affinities. In your work, you explore the links between plants, people, and history, seeing plants as political actors, which I find really interesting for our discussion tonight. Your practice is research-based, process-oriented, and multidisciplinary. And while looking for spatial manifestations of memory and blind spots of representation, you often unearth astounding micro-histories. Lili, you are an architect and member of the Feral Atlas Collective, curated by Anna Tsing, Jennifer Deger, Alda Kiliman-Saxena, and Fei Zhou. And as map director of the Feral Atlas, you are concerned with the unexpected effects of human-made infrastructures on the natural environment and how architecture might learn from them in order to develop a new attitude towards projects and decision-making. And you are with us from Amsterdam tonight. Peter, you are a plant scientist here in Karlsruhe, bringing in some local expertise rooted in the same soil as the ZKM stands on. And you are an expert in molecular cell biology at the KIT Botanical Institute. And we can see the botanical garden in your background, actually. Your research is dedicated to understanding how plants adapt to their environment in order to survive, and what insights this can give us for a sustainable way of life. So that was the three of you in very small highlights. I hope I probably have not said many important things, but I hope I have highlighted the most important ones. And I think it's really nice that we have such different perspectives coming together. And the more I learn about plants, the more I understand how many voices really have to come together to grasp all the complexities around plant life and plant stories. So maybe today will just be a start for some of us, but in any case, you at home, do feel free to ask all your questions and share your thoughts on the Telegram chat and on YouTube, and I will do my best to implement them in the discussion. Right, so as a start to begin our conversation, we should maybe begin with the basic problematic. We are surrounded by plant life. Even in the most dense cities, you will find tread-resistant plants pushing their way through cracks in the pavement. But why is it so difficult for us to pay attention to them? Why don't we notice plants as we notice animals, for example? And I thought, Peter, maybe you could start with this one. And Lili, Uriel, if you want to join in, just add anything and go ahead. Silke.
Yeah, I will try. So we see it when we have guided tours for instance, school classes or so. And when we ask them, after we have shown them all our plants and told the stories about them, what did you like best? Then the children say, well, there were some goldfishes in the pond in our tropical house. And this is basically the problem of plant biologists. What is the reason for it? Well, I think the reason is that maybe related to us, that we are not able to see emotions without similarity. So we are trained to recognize emotions of our fellow humans by looking at their faces using so-called mirror neurons that allow us to feel what others feel. And the more different, if the different shape comes into our eyes, we cannot recognize what it means. So we are still able to feel the emotions of a dog, let's say, or mammal. Already with an insect, we have great problems to feel empathy. And now what about the life form that is basically just standing? It's static. You can see it in my back. It's a still image. If it would be a movie, you wouldn't notice because they are just living in a different time scale. They are moving, but it's like a Japanese no play where you have to look very long time to see that something is changing. So we are not adapted to perceive this. And therefore, we think they are static, and sometimes even some people even thought they are not even alive. So Aristotle said plants are not something between minerals and real living beings. However, it's a deception because these plants, what they do is they cannot move. That's a part of their lifestyle because they do photosynthesis. So they have to be static, but they are able to manipulate the world around them for their purposes, including us, by the way. They do this, for instance, by chemical signals. They do it, for instance, just by attracting us. I just show you one example, which is look here, for instance, a lotus flower. It's amazing. It has some real attraction also for us. And if we would be able to smell this image, and if we would be a fly, we would just be soaked into this because it would smell like a female fly able to mate or willing to mate. So if you are a male fly, there is no way around this plant. So plants are manipulating us all the time, and they survive because they cooperate. They are not living by themselves. They're always cooperating with other life forms. And they in a subtle, delicate way, they manipulate everything around them for their own purpose. So we think we use them, but maybe in fact, we are just their tool and not the other way around. But it's very subtle, it's hidden. That's the reason why we don't see it.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that, you mentioned movement, and we always think movement is connected to life, but probably we have a very narrow view and understanding of movement, right? Because growth or decay or metamorphosis or change can also be viewed as movement. So maybe that's also one thing that we can learn from plants. And also the idea of intelligence, so you mentioned we don't really understand plants, and we don't think that they are intelligent, sentient beings. But actually, I heard this in a podcast of the general ecology program at the Serpentine Gallery. Somebody said, we are more inclined or more ready to talk about artificial intelligence and ascribe intelligence to Siri or Alexa than to plants. And I think that's a very interesting moment there, that we still haven't understood the intelligence of plants, and that's maybe also why we are not ready to, acknowledge them. And this actually also brings me to your work, Uriel, because you always point out that plants have agency. And in your research, you never see them as passive entities that are just there in the stream of history, but you always see them as active witnesses, as agents with a role. And I thought maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this. What do you mean when you say plants have agency, and where does this become apparent?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about plants as accompanying us on our history, and not just as backdrops to our actions, but actually as being involved with us. And often we sort of instrumentalize them, but as Peter just said, they also use us. I mean, wheat is a very good example, because it's a very successful plant by sort of making us cultivate it all over the world. But I'm interested, I suppose, in plants as sort of also historical witnesses, but not just witnesses, but also kind of how plants are involved in history. So, for example, we see here a wild almond tree in Cape Town in South Africa. It's an image of a work of mine. It's actually a negative of this wild almond tree. And this tree was planted in the 17th century when the Europeans first arrived at the Cape in South Africa. It was the Dutch East India Company that was looking for a place to replenish their ships traveling from India to Europe around Africa. And they had a problem with lack of fresh provisions and therefore scurvy due to vitamin C deficiency. So what they did initially was they created a fruit and vegetable garden to replenish the ships. But there was already a local population there, the Kwekwe, who had grazing cattle. And the cattle were also happy with the salads and the vegetables. So the Dutch East India Company planted this wild almond tree as a hedge, a kilometer-long hedge, around the vegetable garden, which was called the company's garden. So in a way, the planting of this tree can be seen as the first act of colonial violence, because it created this separation, keeping the local population out. And the tree, I mean, it's a sort of, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting fact. We know about it, but trees live longer than us. And the tree is still here, or part of this tree is still here. So there is a kind of continuity with history that the tree provides. It's an inadvertent monument, and it's not necessarily labeled, but it's still a monument. Or this tree here, which is a poplar tree in Johannesburg, which was which stood next to the house of Ruth Fisher, an anti-apartheid activist, who gave her house as a safe house to fugitives from the apartheid regime. And when people were fleeing from the police, they were told to find her house and basically to look for this tall poplar tree, and her house would be next to it. So literally, this tree saved lives. And it's again, it's not a monument, it's not labeled as such, but it's part of history. So that's kind of one aspect. Another aspect, which is maybe just briefly, I can talk about geraniums, which are we know really well from the balconies of chalets in the mountains all over Central Europe. They're almost kind of quintessential Swiss flowers or Austrian flowers, but actually they come from the Cape too. The Dutch East India Company brought them to Europe, to the garden centers, and it's not even a geranium, it's a pelargonium. It was misidentified. And so it's true, plants are not moving, but we have also made them move, and now they're sort of naturalized here. And they talk a lot about this movement of us and of plants which are involved in that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in the stories that you shared, that we see how embedded plants are in networks of history, of also political interest. And I mean, we have learned to harness plants as resources. I mean, we're controlling our food production, medicinal needs, cosmetic desires, economic interests. And this kind of control of plants, I mean, we kind of saw it with the hedge that you mentioned, where we installed the hedge as a an infrastructure, a human-made moment into the natural environment. But this also always comes with unexpected side effects, right? So these interventions have a lot of unplanned reactions, like plants react to them, for example. And this is oftentimes completely outside of human control. And Lili, this is, I'm obviously pointing to you with this one, because this is what the Feral Atlas is about. So maybe you could quickly explain what you mean by feral or ferality, and how this shows in the atlas.
Yes, so thanks, Barbara. So feral, for Feral Atlas has a very specific meaning. I mean, in general, feral as a word, it sounds negative, but it's not negative or positive, because feral effects are all around us all the time, and plants are particularly good at demonstrating what we could call ferality, which is simply the kind of the reproduction of, flora and fauna on their own cycles, beyond human cycles and rhythms, and yeah, all the time. So for instance, you kind of toss like a bit of a fruit core on the ground, an apple for instance, and an apple tree may grow and it may thrive there. Or maybe I can share my screen. Let's see, or maybe not. Or Barbara, you mentioned, you have plants that kind of find their way into the grouting of cracks in pavements. But for Feral Atlas, these are feral effects, but actually we're particularly concerned with those feral effects that are kind of bad ferality effects that go out of control. And on the right, this is a picture of a photograph of a plant called Phragmites australis, which is European common reed. And this is a plant that's taking over and radically altering ecologies across North America. And I think here ferality means, a kind of plant that kind of takes hold and really upsets the entire ecosystem and makes that place unlivable for species that were once living there quite happily before. And the seed for Phragmites was likely transported from Europe to ports on the east coast of the United States during the 19th century. So merchant ships would kind of travel over from Europe in order to collect cargo from the New World to bring it back to Europe. And on their voyage over, they would carry ballast in their hold, which was made up of kind of mud and rocks and sand and gravel as a way of stabilizing the ships, because they weren't carrying cargo at that point. And mixed up in this ballast were the seeds of Phragmites australis, colloquially known as European common reed. And when these ships kind of unloaded their ballast in America, they would kind of dump this earth in designated ballast grounds, which at the time were marshland. And this was the perfect environment for this species of plant to take hold. And now you have a situation where, let me see if I can scroll down and show you the map. So now you have reports of Phragmites kind of overtaking ecologies in the United States and actually kind of replacing the native species that were already there. And yeah, there are many stories in Feral Atlas that kind of speak to this sort of behavior of certain types of plants in new places and how they really, take over.
Yeah, I mean, if there's another one that you would want to share, go ahead. I think they're so interesting in making these networks tangible, of how, in that case, global trade routes suddenly connected with a plant species that came and invaded a completely new territory and changed it. So if you want, go ahead I mean, maybe I read the water hyacinth story in the Feral Atlas, and I was really impressed by it. So if you want, you can tell us about that one.
Yeah, I can show you. I think I have the poster page for water hyacinth here. Water hyacinth is an Amazonian aquatic weed. And I think Peter sort of mentioned, how we have, with the picture of the botanic garden there behind you, especially European colonists, transported plants that they deemed particularly beautiful all around the world to kind of occupy, populate the gardens as they were settling in these new places. And water hyacinth is one of them. And so it spread globally, actually a little bit later at the turn of the 20th century. This report in Feral Atlas is by environmental historian Iftikhar Iqbal. And he describes how the construction of the railway, which was a colonial project in the Bengal Delta by the British in the late 1850s, in order to construct this railway, it required the kind of construction of quite sturdy embankments to provide stable ground for the tracks to be laid. And in the construction of these embankments, what it did is it kind of blocked the rush and flow of water that was traveling through the delta out to the sea. And water hyacinth is a plant that loves stagnant water. So by blocking the flow of water through this region, it created the perfect conditions for water hyacinth to grow. This created so many issues, one of which is, when water hyacinth grows, it kind of takes over. It blocks sunlight from reaching the bottom of waterways, rivers, which kills the kind of aquatic plants that are living there, which in turn kills fish, causes a kind of situation of eutrophication, completely alters the ecology. And Iqbal also goes on to say that how, in its sort of spreading through the waterways and the ditches that kind of ran alongside embankments, it also allowed water hyacinth to spread into the paddy fields, which is where crops were being grown. And so in its kind of spread, what water hyacinth did is it took over these fields, destroyed crop production. And so you have a situation whereby in the 20th century, this region had to rely on imports of rice for subsistence, whereas in the 19th century, before the arrival of water hyacinth, they were growing enough rice for themselves. So this is the, a feral effect par excellence.
It kind of also reminds me of what in your work, Uriel, you might call ghosts. I think this notion of the fact that the past comes to haunt us. How you described, Lili, how the water hyacinth, just as an effect of the railway industry, I think 200 years ago or 150 years ago, still, has effects today. Maybe we could consider it a ghost that is haunting us. And Uriel, I mean, maybe you have a story of a plant as a ghost, the idea of a ghost that haunts us, of unresolved injustices, maybe that come back and talk to us today. Oh, are you on mute?
Yes. Well, I'm going to try to share my screen again. Actually, I have quite a few stories, but I'm just going to talk about one, perhaps. I mean, I guess what interests me is in this notion of the ghost and maybe plants as ghosts, which is also one of the reasons why I'm using the negative that I've already shown of the wild almond tree, but also the images behind me is a kind of negative image, actually. It relates to the work in the exhibition, Soil Affinities. It's nettle, it's kind of basically weeds that I photographed outside of Paris in Aubervilliers, which was a kind of center of agricultural production until industrialization. A lot of the food that was consumed in Paris was produced there, and then the factories displaced this food production, and it went elsewhere, including the colonies in West Africa. But the weeds, in a sense, haunt the pavements. You still find edible plants and sort of plants that might be descendants of those agricultural plants on the pavements. And the image of this nettle is just, I mean, it's an edible plant, but it was not cultivated, obviously. But it's one of those weeds. But the image that I'm showing here, big, it's the seed of a Strelitia regina plant, which is also a South African plant. And it does have an interesting story. It looks like this, and a lot of people know this plant. We can buy it in florist shops. Usually they're actually orange. Most of the plants that we can buy in Europe are orange. And in the 60s, a few yellow flowers cropped up in the botanical garden in Cape Town. And this was it was a big thing. They thought, oh, we have a sort of new variety perhaps. So what they started in order to keep this plant was to cross-fertilize the yellow flowers with each other so that they wouldn't fertilize with orange flowers and become orange again. So there was a kind of project that took almost 20 years from the 60s from the 60s onwards to create this new cultivar, which happened to be the same time that Mandela was in prison in Robben Island, just off the coast of Cape Town. And why I'm saying this, because the two stories are somehow connected. What happened when Mandela became the first kind of free elected head in South Africa, the president of South Africa, they named this flower Mandela's Gold. But there is a problem with this plant because it has a predator in the botanical garden, which is the grey squirrel that Cecil Rhodes, the big colonialists, introduced, the English squirrel introduced in this area, which he owned and he bequeathed to the botanical garden. And this English squirrel will eat all the seeds of this flower. So what happens is that each flower, after it's flowered, is encaged in kind of chicken mesh wire to protect it from the European predator. So here it's kind of this meeting of histories. Mandela's Gold has to go back into a prison to be protected from the European predators which are still around, which is the squirrel. So it's a dark irony of history in some ways, and the connection where plants, but animals also, and our history all intertwine. And they are basically sort of reminding us of this history of injustice, of Mandela's imprisonment, so it's not finished, of course, the story with free elections. Maybe apartheid as a system is over, but the cage is still here. The cage in our minds, the social cage, the economic cage is still here. So plants can serve, I guess, as reminders or as ghosts, which is what ghosts are, reminding us of injustices, of stuff that is unfinished business from the past, essentially. So here's one ghost. And I guess the question for us is how we meet the ghost, how we deal with those plants. It's important to tell these stories, and it's important to connect them to wider issues in society and to our interaction with the natural world and with each other.
Yeah, I think that's where also plants really become these political witnesses and actors and places where political histories become apparent. And there, I think it's really interesting to talk about memory. So memory is also kind of something that we relate to intelligence and consciousness. So going back to our initial question, can plants memorize things? Peter, maybe that's a question more in your direction. Do plants more, on top of being ghosts, do plants have a memory?
Yeah, they have. It may sound funny, but my step into science my first paper was, when I was a young student, was about the spatial memory of maize seedlings. And so I had discovered that, plants can bend towards the light, and they also can perceive gravity. So usually when there is a light pulse from the side, they will bend a little bit, but after that they will straighten. And by, frankly speaking, an accident, I discovered that the maize seedling, which is germinating, will remember the direction of the first light it saw. And this memory is first flexible, so you can disturb it when you give the light from another side. It will forget where the first light came from. But 2 hours after the first light impression it is memorizing it and keeps it stable for many days. And then I was intrigued to find out how is it working. Of course, they don't have nerve cells as we have. However, they have cellular kind of filaments. So this is like a network in each cell called microtubules. And these filaments we also have in our nerve cells, and they're important when we learn. Our nerve cells make new connections, and this is stabilized by this network. And plants also have this network. They don't make nerve cells. It's completely different, but interestingly, these microtubules also play a role. So that was my start point as a scientist, basically. So yeah, sure, they can memorize. So they are not like a machine where you switch it back to zero. They have a history. So they memorize what they have experienced, and this will change the way how they respond to future signals or stimuli. Our problem is, again, the time scale. So it's not in milliseconds or seconds as our movements or our actions, what we call behavior, but we talk here about hours or days. And we are just too fast living to perceive this.
Yeah, I think this time scale is really, really interesting. And I think also that was also on this podcast of the general ecology of the Serpentine Gathering, quoting that a lot. But that it was just such an interesting quote of a story where apparently aliens land on Earth and they experience time a lot faster than human beings, and so they don't really notice us as sentient beings. And I just thought that was such a lovely moment where it clicked to me that of course plants are so much slower and they just live in a different time reality, and we really have to slow down if we want to pay attention to them. I just thought that was really interesting. And there is one thing that you mentioned, Peter, that I think is really interesting also in this human-plant relation moment, is that they are so different from us, right? So you mentioned the microtubuli that we maybe have in common, but plants are so different in the shape of their body. For example, they don't have a head, they don't have a central brain or eyes or nose. And maybe can you tell us a little bit more about the differences between human animal cells and plant cells and how this came about in evolution? That would be very interesting.
Okay, so I just try to find a picture of those microtubules. I will find and show you later. So basically, what is the principal difference? The principal difference is that plants, they live basically on light. That's their lifestyle. They don't eat other organisms as we do. They eat light, and therefore they have to open up their internal space outside. So they have to increase space from inside towards the outer side. Therefore, a tree is folded outwards. Yeah, if you have a beech tree, for instance, the area of a beech tree is several squares of a football stadium. However, it's all separated out. We also have a lot of surface. However, our surfaces are put inside because we have to move. So plants they have to live on light, therefore they are spreading from inside out. And that's, I think, one of the reasons, because when you are spreading from inside out, you have to counteract. You need roots that keep you, otherwise you will fall over. So a walking tree would not work. That's not possible. And because of their lifestyle, they are condemned to be static. And therefore, from that point, everything else follows. When you are static, you cannot run away when you are endangered. You cannot search a better place. If you are endangered, you have to adapt. So their strategy is really to adapt, to change themselves. We are not changing ourselves. We are as we are. We just run away. They don't run away. They change themselves. And the second point is, if you cannot run away or do actively that what you need to do by a movement, you have to get others doing it for you. So the principle of plant survival is to interact with other organisms. So they are very social beings. They interact with a lot of organisms. And what's interesting is, and that's a question of the ghosts also, why do we have these ghosts? Because we are not sustainable. We always take a short-term advantage and we don't care for the future. Plants always care for the whole time span. So a solution which is found by a plant is always a balance. It's a balance where both sides have some advantage. And this is the most stable situation. So they're always looking for a good compromise, which is then very stable over a million of years. That's a different type of strategy, I would say.
Yeah, that's probably also how bees, for example, bees and flowers had this evolutionary codependency, right?
Yeah, both sides have. So I told you about this water lily just before, and wait, maybe I see it. Anyway, here you see it. If I share my screen, I think, and these are very ancient plants. So they are from among the first flowering plants. They have already learned to manipulate beetles for their purposes. So the male beetles are attracted by a sexual hormone, which is normally secreted by female beetles. And therefore, they come there on the search for a mating partner, and then they find the pollen, they eat the pollen, but they also just spread the pollen over them. Then they go to the next flower and do the job of pollination. Now, this is a very costly type of pollination. So what plants invented very soon was a way to feed with sugar, because sugar is something very cheap for a plant. Pollen is very precious, of course. This is the cells that are needed for propagation. Nectar is cheap because they do photosynthesis. They are full of sugar, no problem. So they secrete the sugar, and then they also have developed new type of flowers that are just more sophisticated and that are attracting other pollinators that are much more clever and can discriminate different plants, for instance, the bees or the bumblebees and so on. And then we have a situation where both sides profit. The bee has a source of food which nobody else has, and the plant has a pollinator which is intelligent and can recognize this type of plant, and both sides have their profit. And as a result, the bees also become much more intelligent because they have to see all these different type of plants and discriminate them. So they have developed a special part in their brain, which is called the mushroom body. It's something like our neocortex. That means the part of our brain where our consciousness is. And this is then developed, and this makes it possible for bees to have states, because when you have a state, it's very complex. You have to have very complex behavior. And they can do this because they have developed this part of the brain which they needed for doing their pollination job. So both sides have advanced and become more perfect by this cooperation. This is a typical plant story.
Yeah, a typical story of co-evolution and codependency. I think it's really lovely. One thing I thought about whilst you were telling us that is, so as you mentioned, plants can't run away when they get attacked. And I read in a book that, of course, then it makes sense for a plant not to have like a single head where all the vital organs are inside, like the brain, because if some animal or insect comes and bites off that head, the plant would die, right? So that's why they have all their organs and nervous system around all the different parts of their body. So leaf, roots, it's kind of everywhere in their body. And what I think is so interesting about that is that we have, because of that, also talked about plants as monsters a lot. You know, if you look at literature, popular culture, horror movies. Oh, hello. We know a lot of stories of plants as monsters. And I was thinking about that because beforehand we were talking about ghosts. And there is this really lovely book by Anna Tsing, which is called Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. And there it's half about ghosts and half about monsters. And there they talk about monsters of the Anthropocene as pointing to like the inextricable entanglements of our world, where again, political, economic, geographic, climatic, social structures are fully mixed up, and every being and entity is always embedded in this network of complexities, and at the same time makes this network somehow tangible. And this is also kind of aligned with Latour's concept of the climatic regime, right, where he says that every aspect of society is connected to the climate question. But this idea of monstrosity also brings me back to feralities that the Feral Atlas has collected. So, I mean, I asked Uriel if plants are ghosts, and maybe Lili, now I can ask you if plants are monsters, or if you know where this idea of monstrosity as, you know, entanglements of very different aspects becomes clear again.
Maybe as a way of answering this, I can actually dive into something that's kind of tangentially related to Feral Atlas. So for the Driving the Human Festival, Feifei Zhou and I presented at ZKM, and we ran a little workshop which was trying to kind of get everyone to go out and notice feral effects in the areas where they live. And this is where I live, in Amsterdam. And this is going to be a horrible translation, so I apologize for any Dutch speakers out there. But this is a sign about Japanese knotweed. And what the sign says is, it says, okay, 5 times a year on this site, Japanese knotweed is fought by electrocution. Japanese knotweed is an aggressive weed. A small thumbnail-sized piece of stem is enough for it to grow in a new place. And for this reason, planting will only be done here after this treatment is carried out. And so I kind of went on to, I was like Googling around and just seeing, you know, oh, is Amsterdam doing about Japanese knotweed? I mean, Japanese knotweed was introduced to the Netherlands as an ornamental plant, again, as a result of colonial activities in the early 19th century. And it comes from East Asia. And it kind of was introduced to the Netherlands through its botanical gardens as well. And of course, it escaped as plants kind of want to do. And now there are kind of thousands of reports of Japanese knotweed in Amsterdam. And Japanese knotweed is really kind of a pain in the ass, right? Because it grows very quickly, its roots are very strong, it breaks through foundations, it breaks through pavements and tarmac, it bursts into water pipes, and it also causes structural issues to dikes, which are the structures that keep out the sea, the Netherlands being a country, a lot of which is below sea level. So dealing with kind of Japanese knotweed is costing the municipality of Amsterdam kind of millions of euros each year. But what I found fascinating is you can go onto this municipality website and kind of dive in, but the language that's used to describe this plant is really this language of war. You know, the knotweed is the enemy. I think this kind of red active destroy. I mean, this of course is the English translation from Dutch, but still. And then you've got, okay, this, you know, these sites, this one is being electrocuted. This one is being kind of boiled with hot water. Other language used is kind of excavation and burning. And the latest I saw, which was actually a kind of nice segue back into Feral Atlas, is in October last year, when Feral Atlas was published. The municipality of Amsterdam have introduced a new measure to try and kind of tackle the spread of knotweed in Amsterdam, which is releasing 5,000 fleas. I can't remember what they're called, Japanese leaf fleas, in 3 sites in Amsterdam to try and these fleas are kind of known to, I think, Peter, you'll know more about this, but I think they eat the roots of the plant, or they drink its sap and they kind of inhibit its growth and kill it that way. And actually, in order to release these fleas into Amsterdam, the Dutch government had to issue an exemption on a ban on the introduction of alien species to the country. So this, you know, Japanese knotweed is a monster, but, you know, it's been made into a monster also by kind of political and institutional structures. And as a kind of final note, I know in the UK, you know, it's a criminal offence if you introduce Japanese knotweed to your garden. And yeah, I mean, if you're interested in these sorts of plants, like, see what the British government is saying about Japanese knotweed, because the language, again, use this fascinating, I actually have a screenshot here. You know, it's a waste, it's invasive, it's injurious. Anyway, I'll end it there.
That's super interesting. Actually, I did a project in Switzerland a few years ago where I was looking at very similar maps. I think I can share it here, where there's basically maps of all the invasive species in Switzerland and in Zurich. And I sort of traced these plants. And what I was interested as well is, we can see them here, the individual plants. And then I looked at where the plants come from and kind of creating a map that was connecting this first map. And then, as you said, Lili, what I found, what was really interesting is the language that we talk about non-native species. And it's not just the violence or the criminality of having a plant or the damage it can do, but it's often also the kind of competition in terms of habitat, which is very close to how we talk about migration. So I started to track some of the language, which is a threat to the habitat of locals, replaces natives, non-natives turning into problems, crowds out the native population, a threat to our heritage. So it becomes very close to also how we think often about humans that are not from the same place. So while plants obviously do sometimes pose real problems, they can make buildings collapse, as Japanese knotweed can, the way we think about it is also quite problematic. And I think it's a really interesting area, kind of sort of non-invasive weeds or sort of native plants and how we deal with them.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Also, this bundling up of invasive and non-native together as a package, because of course you can have a plant that is native and invasive if it happens to be in a kind of, you know, ecological situation. I don't know, from maybe a feral atlas perspective, it's been kind of, the landscape has been disturbed by humans and a particular native plant species takes hold. But we never really talk about it that way. The two are always together.
Yeah, I also would like to share a story concerning the monsters or phantoms. So I think the monsters are usually the ghosts which have been created by ourselves and have not been pacified because we were acting one-sidedly. And I just show two pictures, and that's a plant. It's not a weed. It's basically one of the most important plants on our planet for humans. That's rice. So rice is coming from a wild rice. You see here the wild rice. It's a wild plant. It's called Oryza nivara. It's the ancestor of our rice. And about 7,000 years ago, humans have domesticated rice out of this plant. You notice something on this plant. It's dropping off the seeds. Of course, it has to drop off the seeds. That's the way how plants spread. If it cannot drop the seeds, it will not survive. And that's what humans have prevented. They have forbidden plants to spread their seeds. So if you have a cultivated rice, it will not drop the seeds. This was one of the first things. It's a specific mutation which was inadvertently introduced by humans about 7,000 years ago. And this allows us to have the seeds and harvest them. But the price for the plant is the loss of autonomy. Now it's suddenly not able to survive without human help. We have to harvest, sow again next year, harvest again, sow again next year. Now we have domesticated the plant. So we have very efficiently suppressed the autonomy of the plant. So now the plant can only survive by human activity, and it's spread by humans, like weeds are spread. So rice or all the other domestic plants, they come usually from limited kind of regions on our planet, about 8 or 9 centers of biodiversity called so-called Vavilov centers. And now they are everywhere. We have spread them. However, the plants strike back. So we have been working for years about a new weed, which is called Weedy Rice. And It is known for a long time. People thought it's a wild rice, but we found out by genetic markers it's not a wild rice, it's a feral rice. So it's a rice which developed from domesticated rice. How did it develop? Well, it reacquired the ability to shed the seeds. Otherwise, it's looking like rice. So you grow it, then it's growing in the paddy. And when you want to harvest it, you don't harvest anything because the seeds have fallen down into the mud where they stay until the next spring. And then the whole thing is repeated. In the meantime, about 50% of the global rice harvest is destroyed or lost because of this weedy rice. It's a big problem. Now, the problem is you can try to spray herbicides, but it doesn't work because this weed is like rice. It is rice. It's feral rice. You cannot find a herbicide that is killing this weed, but not killing your rice. No way. So we could show that how in Italy, where this problem is especially prominent, how over the last 150 years, this weedy rice was taking over. And basically, it's a kind of a revenge. So the plant is regaining its autonomy and it can now survive without our help, but it's using our labor to survive better because of course, it enjoys to be in a rice paddy, being watered, being fertilized, and all these things that humans do for their crop plants. However, it doesn't pay back. And we also found out that the only way to come to terms with this is if we let it live to a certain extent. So if we try to weed it out 100%, it will strike back even more. So we have to make a compromise. So maybe if we let it live, let's say 10% of a paddy is sacrificed to the weedy rice, then we can slow down the evolutionary pace and we still can harvest. However, we are not so smart. We always try to get 100%. And at the end, we will lose 100%. So it's also a phantom, but it's a phantom which is basically like a bad karma. Yeah, it's the consequence of our earlier actions.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because it takes us into the question of control again. So I think one reason why we don't want to acknowledge plants is that we want to control them, right? And then what do we do when we notice that we cannot control them? And this actually brings me back to, I think, the knotweed, because Peter, correct me, isn't the knotweed the japanischer Staudenknöterich in German? Yeah. Right, and it's kind of interesting. We actually have the knotweed as part of the exhibition here in the Critical Zones exhibition. So a few floors below me, there is actually some harvested knotweed.
Be careful; it will invade you.
Oh no, well, probably we should let that happen. I don't know, but it's part of the Biodesign Lab project, and the Biodesign Lab is part of the design school. That is right next to the ZKM. And I think what is interesting, what they're doing is saying, okay, just as plants, we have to adapt. And we have to acknowledge that we don't have the control, but then what do we do with that? And they are trying to use knotweed as a new material for new designs and maybe new architecture, because apparently knotweed has the same characteristics as bamboo. It grows very fast, it's very light and very stable. And I think that's an interesting moment where, you know, when you acknowledge the fact that we cannot control plants and we let this happen, and maybe it started because of us as ghosts, like we said, maybe we can still gain a nice coexistence or codependency. And I think these are probably also the kind of stories that we might need.
I tell you something about the knotweed. You know why it is so successful? Because if you hurt it, it will heal, it will not suffer, it will regenerate even. And it can suppress very efficiently fungal infections or bacterial infections. That's the reason why it's so sturdy. And it's doing so because it's accumulating a compound which is called resveratrol. And this resveratrol is a very precious compound. It can prevent arteriosclerosis. So knotweed is one of the richest sources ever in nature. So we can also utilize it. It's a very important medical plant in Japan, by the way. So that what can be useful for us is also the weapon the plant is using against others to be invasive. So everything has two sides. It's a question of the compromise.
Yeah, and maybe this brings me also to the story, to the idea of storytelling. Then, so now we have just from one example, the knotweed. We've gathered many stories, many aspects of that, and it's something that you said before, Uriel, is what stories do we need right now? So this is also an idea of the Feral Atlas that I found quite interesting, is this mode of storytelling that goes beyond hope or despair, or beyond utopia versus dystopia. And the Feral Atlas, I think, has this attitude of saying we already live on a damaged planet, and we have to learn not to look away, and not only to tell stories of, you know, the perfect green, idealistic, romantic landscape, but we have to learn to tell also terrible stories, maybe without being too discouraging or anything. But that's a question that I want to ask the three of you. What do you think? Do you agree? Do we have to learn to handle terrible stories, or what kind of stories do we need?
Well, I think we need stories where we can learn that if both sides get their legitimate benefit, then everything is fine, and plants can teach us that. So I tell you one story. It's a relative of the Strelitia, which we saw before, this flower, which you remember, the one with the cager on it. And it's the tree of the traveler, Ravenala. It's living in Madagascar. And this tree is living in a symbiosis with a kind of a monkey. It's like a squirrel, actually. It's a small animal, very cute, actually. It's called Ai, the finger animal. It has a very long middle finger to pull out some worms and so on from the wood. And this animal is pollinating this tree of the traveler, and it's a very kind of a mutual relationship. So it's also fed by the seeds, but it's doing a very good job. And the plant is paying rewards in a very unusual way. So this Ai is almost blind. It can see only blue light in the dusk. And in order to mark its territory, it's using a very special type of urine. In the urine, it has a compound which is called bilirubin, which is fluorescent in the evening. And by this, it has fluorescent blue marks, and this helps it to mark the territory. And this compound, this fluorescent marker, is made by the tree of the traveler. So it's feeding this compound that helps the animal to keep its territory and have its, of course, its female and also its own food source. And so both sides live happily with that. And I think this is one of the many examples where we can see that plants always find a way to have a compromise with other life forms. And this is sustainable, and this is smart, and this is clever, and we can learn a lot of it. And we won't have any phantoms if we learn this lesson, to my opinion.
All right. You dropped your camera a bit. We need your whole face.
Sorry. Okay.
Thank you. And but I'm passing on the question to Lili and Uriel again. So Peter said we need these stories of, maybe we might call it symbiosis or co-evolution or codependency. What would you say? What stories do we need? Maybe Lili first, and then Uriel. No.
I mean, maybe this is answering the question with another question, because I mean, I'm trained as an architect. I don't really know anything about the kind of lives of plants, but I wish I did. And, you know, it's really, I find it as a personal, you know, frustration, you know, because, you know, still as a designer working for designers, you know, plants are still very much seen as kind of objects and ornaments. And it seems that to really understand, what they do in a very particular place, because of course all sites are unique, and the plants there, you can't determine what they're going to do based on their species classification. It's really about, what they do in that place. How do you understand how they're interacting when, maybe this is circling right back around to the first question, our kind of human cycles and paces are so fast that there's not really any moment to really listen and understand plants, but we have to. So my question would be how, and I genuinely don't know, and maybe this is also a conversation that can extend, but I mean, personally, it's something that I would love to know, but I don't.
Maybe we'll save that question for one round and stick to the storytelling question still with Uriel. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think storytelling is a way, the stories we tell ourselves of the world and of ourselves is a way to see the world, to make the world, and to understand the world. And I think plants and the stories about plants that we tell, and I think a lot of them are not told, which is why I'm interested in these plant ghosts and phantoms, because a lot of them are not told, and I think they reveal other stories about us. It's not just plants themselves. And I think what we're experiencing today with the environmental crisis is a series of overlapping crises, and it's just the tip of something that is connected with previous stories of violence, oppression, extraction, all of these things leading to the problems we have now. And I think the stories that we can tell about plants, like the way plants do medicine, for example, how they defend themselves, how plants were involved in our projects of colonialism, of oppression, allows us maybe to recalibrate our relationship with them, with us, with the world, and to begin to tell new stories. So I think, yeah, we need a lot of different stories, and in a sense, we need more voices in the stories that we tell. And maybe, I mean, yes, perhaps we've been anthropomorphizing plants a little bit in this conversation, and if I say we need plants to tell their stories, and we need the voice of plants, we're doing it even more. But yeah, I think we also need to listen to the way plants perhaps speak, which is without language, without moving, without words. And they do very interesting things. And I think it's useful to look at that and to learn from that, and to be humble and say, this is actually a really interesting thing.
Yeah, and maybe this kind of leads to the question Lili asked, the question of the how, and this would actually also be kind of my like closing question, but it might open some new things up. I don't know. Is this so really how do we do it? How do we learn to listen to plants again? And yeah, especially if we don't want to anthropomorphize them. And how do we? Maybe it's a lot about what also Anat Singh would say, the arts of noticing. You know, the arts of paying attention, of developing new practices of attention, new modes of perception. So I think maybe I'll ask Lili first, because I know that you've been doing a lot of workshops around the Feral Atlas. You did one here in the context of the Driving the Human Festival, but workshops in which you kind of want to, you say, take the Feral Atlas as a verb and kind of develop new strategies of attention, maybe. Could you share the take of the workshop on the question, how do we learn a new attention toward plants?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a vague answer, but you know, what I found is just by kind of, you know, following the threads of, you know, you notice something and just following those yeah, kind of pulling out the threads of each of the things that this thing you've noticed is engaged in can tell you so much. And that often, it kind of ends up, as Uriel has, already, said, and also in, your work, like, it tells us about human histories, it tells us about non-human and more than human histories, it tells us about contemporary politics, it tells us about ourselves, and also, again, one of the things that I found is like following plants, diving into research, listening to others who are also researching this, which is really important, that, the more voices, the better. Still, personally, I find so often myself slipping into human stories and moving away from the plant stories. Because Barbara, as you already said, we think of plants as an ornament, as a resource, as an instrument, as a whatnot, but never really just as themselves.
Maybe a question, the same question to Peter, since you're teaching. You work a lot with students. How do you teach them to be attentive to plants? Like, if you have a advice to other educators.
I think the most important point is to raise the awareness for mystery. So humans are curious. Already the smallest child is curious, and everything what is mysterious, which is outside of our common way of thinking, is basically attracting attention. So it's important to show how fascinating plants are and how different they are, and that there are many worlds which we just don't perceive because we are just too dumb to perceive it. And this works usually quite well. And the other important tool is to make clear that plants are related to us. So I have to teach botany. So to teach botany to first year students is not always an easy task. So traditionally, this is thought to be something which is not really fun for both sides. However, I changed the lectures and I called it basically crop plants, or in German Nutzpflanzen, plants which we use. And that means when I give lectures on plants, I also exchange recipes, or I explain what would you do in the jungle if you would be wounded, how would you survive? And this is a way how you can catch them. So because it's related to them, we are living on plants and we are very often not aware of this, that we are living on plants. And if we shift this into our consciousness, then people are automatically first interested, and second, they are attentive. And then they learn to observe. We have just to observe without judging, because we cannot judge it. It's so different from our usual values of judgment that we just can observe and try to see. That's it.
Recipes is a good keyword, and I'm going to address that to Uriel in just 1 second as a really last comment. But I just saw on the chat that there is one question, and I wouldn't want it not to be heard. And it's from Maxo, and he says, he goes back to the timescale thing that we mentioned. He says, I heard plants live in different time spheres, like one tree to another tree, one tree species to a different tree species. Can you measure that? He asks. I'm not quite sure. So.
Okay, so now of course we can try to measure growth, which is already difficult enough. You have to be very patient, but I'm not sure whether this was the time scale of the question. It may be that it was more evolutionary time scale. So yeah, we cannot observe it because we are too short-lived and we are too fast-living. So we only can infer it. That means we see some signs and we can make a story, but we cannot really perceive it really by ourselves. And that's the problem. Also the problem of plant intelligence. For instance, we are also working on the way how plants perceive the world. So they have, for instance, they have 3 photoreceptors to see colors. So they are as good as we are in distinguishing different colors. The question is, do they perceive a color? I don't know whether you perceive the colors in the same way as I do. Well, we use language to exchange our experience, and we match, but it's because we learned this. But what do you do if your opponent or the life form in front of you is not talking in the same language? You don't know. You only can try to infer it by specific experiments. So this is the problem. We are so different that we are not even able to perceive in the points where we are basically not different, but overlapping. That's the problem.
Perhaps in relation to this, the point of language and the question of how we tell stories. And you just said, Peter, we don't speak the same language. And you mentioned earlier, Anat Singh's The Art of Noticing, that we need to maybe change the way we notice things, slow down, see things differently. And Lili talked about research and following the connections. And it also kind of makes me think, this kind of language, and that we speak a different language, makes me think of something that Trinity Minha, a filmmaker, was talking about. When you work about something as an artist, you might not want to speak about it, you might want to speak nearby. So what is speaking nearby? We might not be able to speak the plant's language, but we can speak nearby the plant. So perhaps we need to find new ways of being nearby and of showing this nearby, rather than occupying plants and say, this is it, we've captured it, now we can represent it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because now questions are starting to pop up. I don't want to take too much of your time, but this actually is really a great segue, what you just said, both of you, for a question from Felipe. And he's saying, is sentience, consciousness, having a soul, being animated, being a subject, a property of a living being, or a concept of us negotiating the relationships between humans and non-humans? So maybe we've answered that already, but do you maybe have one more comment on this?
Mm-hmm. This is a very good question. So I personally think that that what we call personality is something which is not only in ourselves, it's basically a social phenomenon. We are a person because we are communicating with other humans. And now the question is whether plants can be kind of entities, whether they have something which is whole or entire. And I think one difference is that plants are much more collective. You can cut off a piece of a plant and it will make a new plant. So you have whole woods. There has been a wood bee discovered some years ago in Queensland. It's a extinct tree which was thought to have died out 40 million years ago, and it still exists, and it's a little wood, but it's all the same plant. So it's basically the same, it's just a clone. So the question of individuality is different in plants than in animals or in humans. However, also plants have a collective interaction with them among themselves. For instance, they are exchanging wound signals and warn their neighbors when they are attacked by insects. So the neighbors already can start to produce defense compounds and to ward off the insects. So they're acting in an altruistic, collective way across borders, by the way, also from species to another species, they do that. In the meantime, people have found out they even can hear whether an insect is eating the neighbor. So they can perceive sound and they can respond to it. So there is a lot of interaction also between plants, and it's an interesting question to what extent plants also form communities that are comparable to communities we have in humans. So it's just very different, but I think if we are getting out of our box a little bit, we would perceive that there is a lot of things we normally would not expect from plants to be able to do.
There's just another question that popped up, and I'm just going to take two more, okay? I hope it's okay. But this one is also really interesting because it says, in order to tell plant stories, to see them maybe as individuals, characters, do we also have to think about rights for plants, environments, biotopes, like we think about rights for animals? Just, I don't know, Uriel, Lili, Peter, just jump in. Is there actually a case where plants?
There are discussions like this. I know in Switzerland there is an initiative rallying for plant rights. I would say it may be important to discuss on what level the right is endowed, whether it's on the individual plant or whether it is on the plant species. If it's on the plant species, I think, yeah, sure, they should have rights, like other species have rights or should have rights. On an individual level, I'm not completely sure, because an individual plant relates to a plant like a cell in my body to my body. Mm-hmm. So I would not also assign rights to a single cell in my body, but my body has a right. And the same may be true for plants. So there maybe are more collective, maybe, but I think any life form on this planet has the right to persist, to exist. And if we are ignoring these rights, we will create a lot of phantoms that will take revenge. That's what we were discussing.
Yeah, I think there are probably this opens up like a potential new terrestrial university, actually, because I'm thinking that there's this project in Australia also to give rights, for example, to a river, or there's also a lot of problematics around big companies who want to patent a certain seed type, for example. That's for example what the work of Edith Morales is speaking about, of a special corn type that is used by indigenous people in Mexico, and there's this huge company who wants to patent it. So probably that's where this aspect of right also becomes very interesting, and maybe that's a subject for a new terrestrial university. As a last question from the chat, I mean, stuff is popping up. I'm very sorry if we can't put all of them in, but we have Masse, who is very concerned with our office plants, and who is asking, did we all leave our offices during the pandemic, and what became of our office plants? So I don't know, Uriel, Lili, Peter, how are your office plants doing, in case you have any? Uriel, do you want to go?
Well, my plants are with me. So as an artist, I don't have an office that I abandon. So yeah, I've kind of had my plants with me. So that's not really, it's not really a problem.
They're safe, okay.
They're safe. I think offices were basically, I mean, I just read recently that there's a huge problem in London with rats invading offices, because there is no one there, and there is like little bits of food left in drawers of desks. And there is a huge invasion now in big office buildings where the rats kind of have taken over.
Okay, that's crazy. Lili, any rat experiences or healthy plants?
But actually a colleague of mine, just before the office closed because of the pandemic, took a cutting from a fig tree that we had in the office. And in the past year, it's gone from having 1 leaf to 4 leaves. And it's been kind of amazing to watch this thing grow, because, it's kind of nothing happens, or, nothing happens. We can't see anything happening. And then all of a sudden, in the space of a week, this leaf appears, and then it kind of, so yeah, very enjoyable to watch.
Nice.
I think the plant in the office is doing fine.
That's good. Yeah, mine is okay as well. We thankfully have enough colleagues who come in and who always care for plants. So I'm really thankful to them. This shout out to them, by the way. And Peter, I mean, you have an entire glass house, right? That takes care of your plants. How are they doing?
Yeah, I tell you a story about our gardeners. When there was the first lockdown, we were discussing how to deal and what happens if there would be a case of corona, and then the whole garden crew would need to stay in quarantine, how to maintain the garden. And then so we decided to make shifts, and then they suggested, well, if we would have a case, we would make the quarantine in the garden. We will not leave our plants. We will stay with our plants. I found this very overwhelming. So this is the right attitude. So I think plants have to live also on our relationship. So if we have office plants or plants at home, it's important that we act on a regular basis. Plants always need regularity. So they are very kind of reliable, very long-term beings. And they also expect this from our side.
All right. That's a good advice. And last thing, just because I said it before, recipe. Uriel, do you want to leave us with one recipe or one tip, one advice, maybe from your cookbook or anything?
Well, I'm going to talk about the nettles behind me. I collected some nettles earlier, and I actually had them for lunch. And it's a good time. Nettles are growing now. It's very easy to prepare them. They do sting, so you have to be careful when you collect them. But if you put them in hot water for just maybe 2 minutes to boil them, they don't sting anymore. They're delicious. I use a bit of lemon and olive oil and salt, and they're full of nutrients, and it's an amazing accompaniment to a meal.
Lovely. Well, I think we couldn't have a better way to end our conversation than with a nice recipe that everybody can do over the weekend. And maybe, so if I try to summarize our conversation, which is actually impossible because it started even before the live stream started. So I think what I'm taking away from this are really two things. So first of all, plants don't just vegetate. So vegetate is a super interesting word because if you look it up in the Cambridge Dictionary, it actually means to live in a way that has no physical or mental activity, but it actually comes from the Latin word vegetare, which means to invigorate, to fill with life. So I think their cultural history has kind of left a trace on etymology. But yeah, plants are very much alive and active beings that are embedded in these complex political, economic, environmental, societal, multi-species networks that tell us a whole lot about the critical zone. And I think a second point really is that we need to develop a new mode of perception to become, like we said, aware of our connectedness to plants if we want to, I think Haraway would say, if we want to live and die well together. And yeah, maybe a third thing that I'm taking away is that there is still so much work to be done and so many stories to tell and discover. And as you said, Uriel, I think we need much more voices and much more diverse voices actually to maybe rediscover them also. So yeah, let's keep exchanging them. And we'll continue our Terrestrial University series. And actually here at ZKM next week, we'll have a critical break on Instagram, and there we'll be talking about ecological movements during the pandemic. So yeah, it actually makes me think of the rights that we just very closely mentioned, and the Hambacher Forst, which was in Germany kind of a big issue during the pandemic. So that's the question that we'll be moving on to next week. And yeah, everybody is really welcome to follow our program. You can find everything on our website. You keep exchanging recipes or stories about your office plants on Telegram also if you want. And we feel really lucky to be in touch with everybody despite the fact that the ZKM is still closed. And yeah, my last words have to be a huge thank you to everyone who made this Terrestrial University possible. So the curating team, the communication department, the museum communication, the video studio. So hello to Tim, who is our technical host right now. And of course to you, our audience, and to Lili, Uriel, Peter, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for having joined us tonight. And yeah, have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.